Welcome to a new episode of Astrid, your dietitian with T, no C. And my pleasure today is that I'm going to be talking with Alan Aragon. We will going to be touching on all things nutrition facts that we need to be more aggressive at digging into. So I've got a heap of questions for you that are basically coming from a bit of digging that I did on your Alan Aragon research review, and I love your research review, by the way. Guys, you need to subscribe to his research review. Is just amazing. He's the guy. So I wanted to sort of bring up some of the old questions. Like I went through probably 20 issues and sort of started picking different questions that I found that they're very interesting and they are still kind of very relevant for us today. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you in the first place was when we think about cardio, you know that everyone needs or feels like they need cardio. And sometimes, obviously, it depends on the goal that we are aiming for, whether we need to do cardio or not. But I guess we also need to think about the benefits of doing cardio as just engaging with this type of endurance cardiovascular exercise for longevity and health. But when we think about whether it is optional or necessary, depending on a specific goals, let's say fat loss or a specific sport, what do you think cardio falls into being necessary or optional?
That is a great question. And as you mentioned in your question, thankfully, is it boils down to the goal. It just boils down to the individual goal because cardio is a tool and you're not going to use every tool in the toolbox just because you have a lot of tools to use. Cardio is not some sort of mandatory programming element. This is because everybody's individual circumstances differ. Some people have very little non-exercise activity. Some people have a lot of non-exercise activity, whether it is because of their job or their recreational interests or a combination of those things. But ultimately, it comes down to the goal. So when somebody says, is cardio necessary? For what? What's the goal?
And again, we also got to think about it may not be necessary, but somehow it's still quite beneficial for you to engage with some amount of cardiovascular exercise just because the benefits they bring into your cardiovascular health and your circulation benefits have your level of mental health, brain. So it has a lot of benefits. So it's not to be completely disregarded. Now, if probably time is a constraint or there is an injury or some other limitations and you think that you have to do cardio and that brings you misery, maybe that's when you have to think about maybe I don't necessarily need to be just suffering because I have to do cardio. You don't have to, but it's beneficial.
And I would say that it's beneficial, still dependent on the individual's level of non-exercise activity. Because you can take somebody who works as a server at a restaurant or even personal trainers. When I was personal training 15, 20 years ago, I was on my feet. I was walking around the gym the whole time. I was handing people weights. I was racking weights. I was on my feet for 8, 10 hours at a time. I've been a server as well at a restaurant, moving constantly the whole time, 8 hours at a time. Those people don't need cardio. I mean, if they like it, if they want to take an extra hour stroll just to get out of their head, just to kind of relax and have sort of a meditative walk, that's fine, but they don't necessarily need it. Somebody who enjoys resistance training that has a significant cardiorespiratory element or a significant maybe endurance demand element, they don't need cardio. Think of people who do CrossFit. Do you think they honestly need to go ahead and do some cardio after their CrossFit exercise? No. And so resistance exercise exists on a continuum of influence from the cardiorespiratory and endurance type demands. And so if you're doing resistance training, for example, that is a circuit style, or that involves things like drop setting, things like cluster setting, or drop cluster sets, which I've been doing, which is really fun. You don't need to do cardio. So, especially if you do a fair amount of volume of that type of training. And so I think there is a myth that won't die that everybody needs to set aside some time to do formal cardio, because that doesn't take into account what they're doing pre-existently in their current programs and lifestyles. I've had several clients who are desperately trying to gain weight, desperately, and sometimes in a dire situation where they need to gain weight for health. Those people should freaking avoid programming formal cardio into their programs if they need to gain weight really desperately.
I agree. I have those too. They are obsessed with cardio. I'm like, no, you don't need to do more cardio.
Yeah.
Because it's an extra energy expenditure that you could save if your intake is limited or your appetite is compromised. And if you're engaged with something that increases your energy expenditure, gaining weight is going to be much more challenging at the end of the day. But I had a question for you before I forget.
Yeah.
That was around intensity and sort of like levels of cardio. We hear zone 2, zone 3, zone 5, so on 20, I don't know. But the point is that any relevance? Does it have any relevancy when it comes to engaging with some sort of endurance training or cardiovascular exercise for the benefits they can have, regardless whether we want to gain weight or lose body fat, or regardless of what the goal is? Should we still have some sort of engagement with higher intensity cardio that may have something to do with more benefits, or not at all?
The idea of intensity levels with cardio, what you'll see frequently is people unintentionally exhibiting their biases when they make these recommendations. So if we're talking about altering body composition, then it doesn't matter. Do what you prefer or not. Or don't do it at all. It's one of those things that it's a personal preference thing. A lot of times in the conversation of health, cardiorespiratory health, longevity, and all that stuff, people make the mistake of imposing their endurance training hobby onto the goal. So you see a lot of folks who are either former competitive endurance athletes or current recreational endurance athletes smuggling in the idea that everybody needs to train as an endurance athlete to optimize health. That's just not true. That's just not freaking true. The longest living people on the planet, they don't endurance train for the most part. I mean, some of them do with their hunting and gathering practices, but for the most part, the longevity champs of the planet do some walking around, they do some gardening, and they do some building, some farming, some foraging. And that's it. They're not doing 80% zone 2 training with 20% VO2 max pushing. They're not doing that. If you have an endurance hobby, don't smuggle it into the conversation about what everybody needs to do to optimize health. What you need to do to optimize health is not be sedentary in the way that you prefer to do it, and get lean or get leaner if you're not lean already, and just stay physically active in resistance training. You don't necessarily have to train for 1 rep maxes. You don't necessarily have to train for pushing up VO2 max. But if you enjoy it as a hobby, fine.